Hi everyone, I'm David Fisher, and this is Presidential Chronicles, the series of books and videos on American history as seen through the lives of the presidents of the United States. This episode is from the life of George Washington, and the focus is first in peace. The year is 1784, the Treaty of Paris has been signed, the Revolutionary War is over, Washington has resigned his commission from the military, he comes back home to Virginia and Mount Vernon, and he is perfectly content to be a gentleman farmer. Washington is a very hands-on plantation owner, and so he gets back into that rhythm, managing the business on a day-to-day basis, but also welcoming guests, because his stature, of course, is now elevated amongst anyone in the United States, and his colleagues, his friends, his former soldiers, all manner of folk simply start showing up at Mount Vernon almost on a daily basis, and he doesn't turn anyone away. He welcomes them into his home. He actually gives them meals and drink, and he enjoys it. It's a bit overwhelming, but Washington is very content here to move off into his retirement with Martha and live out his life as a country squire. The problem is the country isn't done with him yet, and the country is struggling. Washington went to war to fight for a cause, independence, and a new union, a new country that he believed needed to have some semblance of strong central authority, not a king, not a monarch, but something to bind the nation together. And now, in the aftermath of the war, under the Articles of Confederation, the government as a single unicameral branch of Congress is weak, it's inept, it has no authority, and everything is starting to fracture. States are going every which way on their own, they're starting to charge each other taxes and tariffs, the economy is not, goods are not flowing from one state to the next, there's challenges internationally as well, and Washington is very concerned. In fact, he's very concerned about the economic implications of all of this because he is, after all, a businessman. And he gets so distressed at one point that he actually creates a mini treaty amongst himself with guests from Pennsylvania, Maryland, and Virginia coming together, and he helps facilitate sort of a mutual trade agreement, if for no other reason, to have his goods being moved more freely throughout these particular states. But this, he knows, is inadequate, and he's distressed, and he shares with his friend James Madison, his fellow Virginian, "No morn ever dawned more favorable than ours did, and no day was ever more clouded than the present." He's worried that this is not going to work. Now, he supports Madison and Alexander Hamilton of New York, who used to be on his staff in the Revolutionary War, to go hold a conference on economics in Annapolis, which is what they call for, and they ask all the states to show up. Well, the event is in 1786 in September. Only 5 states show. And so there's really not much they can do other than be distressed about the outcome. Madison and Hamilton agree with the other folks who show up in Annapolis that they need to make some fundamental changes to these Articles of Confederation if this country is going to have a chance. So they are out there to call for a constitutional convention, as it was later called, but a convention to amend the Articles in Philadelphia back at Independence Hall in the following year. The real question at hand was, is anybody going to show up? When they called for this conference in Annapolis, again, only 5 states and about a dozen people showed. The key to everything, everyone believes, is Washington. If George Washington could get behind this event, then they believe the states would follow. He was that important to the cause. But Washington isn't sure he wants to get involved. Washington's reputation, which is incredibly important to him, is at an all-time high. He had just beaten the British in this miraculous military victory in the Revolutionary War, and frankly, he sees very little upside for him personally, but a lot of downside in putting his name in this new convention effort to try to resolve the issues under the Articles of Confederation. But a couple of things has Washington changed his mind. First of all, he's inundated by fellow Virginians who are pushing him and prodding him and saying he needs to engage and support this cause, or their whole fight for a single union is going to evaporate anyway. He's concerned about the economics. We've discussed that. He's also concerned about a new rebellion. Western Massachusetts, there's a bunch of former military members from the Revolutionary War who have gone back to their farms, and frankly, they think the state of Massachusetts and the outrageous taxes that are being levied upon them is practically worse than what the British were doing. And so they're starting to rebel. This is under a gentleman by the name of Daniel Shays, who gets a lot of these former veterans together, and they shut down the courts, because if the courts are shut down, nobody can foreclose on them when they can't pay or when they refuse to pay. Well, eventually the militia is formed in Massachusetts to quell this rebellion, but Washington and many other states are really concerned about this. If it could happen here, it could happen elsewhere, and the federal government, the National Congress, was completely impotent when it came to dealing with what was called the Shays Rebellion. So Washington finally agrees that he will attend this convention in Philadelphia in the summer of 1787, and when he announces a total of 12 states show. Only Rhode Island decides not to show. So they've got the quorum, everyone's there, and the question is, well, what's going to happen? Well, the first thing is they elected Washington the president of the convention. In part, this meant that he actually was going to have very little speaking part, because he would sort of administer the event and he would let others do most of the debating. Well, this was actually fine for Washington. He had been in the Virginia House of Burgesses for years, was never an active debater when it came to policy. He was, again, more the strong, silent type, but his presence was incredibly important. Well, this time it was also a bit awkward, because a big part of the discussion in the convention was about the executive, in this idea of having a three-branch system of government, an executive, a legislature, and a judiciary, when everybody in that room knew the first executive was going to be George Washington. He knew it. They all knew it, and so he sat there in silence, though, as they debated basically his job and what the authorities he would have, how he would interact with the other branches of government, perhaps what the limitations would be, even how he would be elected, his tenure. All of these things were being decided while Washington basically sat there in silence. Well, at the end of the summer, they have the vote. Almost everybody signs on, a couple did not. It is approved by the convention, and Washington is among those who is mostly satisfied. As he says, it is the best that could be obtained at the time. If nothing had been agreed, anarchy would soon have ensued. A constitutional door is open for future amendments and alterations, and this is what most of them thought. This is as good as they could get. It's pretty good. It's new. It's a different kind of government than anybody has tried in the world. They're confident in it, but it probably has some flaws. We'll fix it with amendments later. For now, though, they needed ratification. And ratification, per the convention, was 9 states. Well, some signed up immediately. Delaware right out the door, and a few others followed, but they got to 8 pretty quickly. But the 2 biggest states, New York and Virginia, they were proving to be a little more difficult, and their votes they knew were going to be pretty close. So Madison and Hamilton start writing a bunch of essays that they called the Federalists, published in New York, to try to convince these delegates to support the Constitution. In Virginia, Madison is certainly on point, but Washington, who does not go to the ratifying convention, plays an incredibly important role. Again, his influence really matters, and he writes a bunch of letters trying to urge the delegates, when they get to the convention to ratify, to vote in its favor. Again, the best that could be achieved at the time. We can amend it later, but this is a great start, and Washington's influence really does matter. At least that's according to one of the delegates to the ratifying convention in Virginia, James Monroe, the future president, who actually votes against the Constitution, but he agrees that Washington's influence, quote, carried this government. Behind the scenes, he wasn't even there, but his advocacy really made a difference. With New York and Virginia coming online with close votes, but coming online, 11 states had ratified, and it is time to now pick representatives, senators, and of course the president. Well, again, there's no question who everyone wants to be president. That's George Washington. The only question was whether Washington would accept. Once again, he demurs. What's the upside for him? His reputation could be tarnished. This is going to be a really hard job. But again, everybody comes out of the woodwork, not just Madison and Hamilton and other Virginians. Even the Marquis de Lafayette from Europe, who had fought with him in the Revolutionary War, is saying, to his general, you must serve. The country needs you to take on this role. Eventually, he agrees. He writes a note to Edward Rutledge, one of his friends and colleagues. I consider this last great sacrifice made for the good of my country. I had concentrated all my schemes, all my views, all my wishes within the narrow circle of domestic enjoyment. but it was my duty to embark again on the tempestuous and uncertain ocean of public life. With this last great sacrifice, I gave up all expectations of private happiness in the world. Washington would just have assumed to go off and be that country squire, gentleman farmer, live out his days at Mount Vernon with Martha and ride on his reputation that he's already built. But he also recognized that wasn't what the country needed. The country needed a stabilizing force, and that for President of the United States had to be George Washington. So in April of 1789, he leaves Mount Vernon, heads to New York to take his oath of office as the first president. But that's the story for another day. That is George Washington and First in Peace, from the life of George Washington. For more Presidential Chronicles, check out my books on Amazon.com, and don't forget to subscribe to my YouTube channel. Until next time, I'm David Fisher, and this is Presidential Chronicles.